Now they've converted some of those gunships to working in the river fleet. A lot of them are tasked with anti-air defense, so they're shooting down Shahed drones. Some of them are in the north, and they're tasked with preventing incursions from Belarus. Actually, he revealed that a lot of Russian reconnaissance groups have been trying to come down the Dnipro from Belarus and penetrate Ukraine's defensive to try and conduct sabotage operations, and part of their mission had been to clear those out and to prevent those happening. But he also told me his river fleet, that the gunboats especially, had been providing artillery support, firing on the Russian banks and the Russian positions on the Dnipro in order to help large numbers of troops in the hundreds land there.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're catching up with Maxim Tucker, an editor on the Times' foreign desk, who was Kyiv correspondent between 2014 and 2016. Maxim has returned to report from the front lines of the war since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, and he's just back now. Maxim, good to see you again. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Now, a large part of your reporting was based around the Dnipro River and the Ukrainian advances across it onto the left bank. Can you just give us an overview of what exactly is going on there?
Yeah, so Ukrainian special forces have been raiding the left bank of the Dnipro for some months now, ever since actually the Russians blew up the Novokakhovka Dam. And I spoke to commanders on the Ukrainian river flotilla who said that that kind of special forces raids have now turned into a full offensive operation, and that Marines were now landing in force across the river to try and drive the Russians back far enough for them to build pontoon bridges and bring across heavy equipment. And this is part of an effort to break the stalemate that General Zaluzhny was talking about a few weeks ago, where Ukrainian forces have really just run into very heavy fortifications in the Zaporizhia region and can't break through. The defenses along the Dnipro riverbank are much more penetrable, although it's obviously difficult to cross a river, especially at this time of year when it's very cold and icy. But the Ukrainians are trying to do that now.
And can you just talk us through how the Ukrainians have been making those advances across the river? What vessels do they have, and how are they using them in those crossings?
So they've been given a lot of fast patrol boats by the US. They've also seized a lot of civilian vessels from Ukrainian and repurposed them. And they have modern gunships that are providing artillery support to those landings. It's still very difficult to navigate the river. There are a lot of mines that the Russians have placed, and this is a kind of swampland, very dense vegetation, which can be helpful in covering some of their assaults and providing cover from Russian drones, but it also is quite difficult going to get through that, and especially to get through that in force. And at the moment, it can only really be infantry advances because they haven't got those pontoon bridges in place to bring heavy equipment across.
And you met the deputy commander of the river fleet. How did he explain how the operation has grown and how his fleet has adapted to support that?
So they all have an interesting story on the river fleet. They're primarily Navy men who'd been in the Black Sea or the Azov Sea, and some of their vessels had been destroyed by the Russians when they first started the full-scale offensive. And now they've converted some of those gunships to working in the river fleet. A lot of them are tasked with anti-air defense, so they're shooting down Shahed drones. Some of them are in the north, and they're tasked with preventing incursions from Belarus. Actually, he revealed that a lot of Russian reconnaissance groups have been trying to come down the Dnipro from Belarus and penetrate Ukraine's defensive to try and conduct sabotage operations, and part of their mission had been to clear those out and to prevent those happening. But he also told me his river fleet, that the gunboats especially, had been providing artillery support, firing on the Russian banks and the Russian positions on the Dnipro in order to help large numbers of troops in the hundreds land there. Now, it's still very heavy going for the Ukrainian troops who get across the Dnipro. It's very difficult to supply them. They've got to have boats running backwards and forwards, and some of his ships are also conducting evacuation missions. So they're pulling out wounded soldiers, they're rotating soldiers who've been positioned there for a long time, and they're bringing in supplies and ammunition. But I also spoke to a special forces captain who was taking his men and leading the way through this kind of dense undergrowth and these lakes and reservoirs that are all along the Dnipro River delta. And he said how difficult it is, how Ukrainian Marines are paying the price for trying to make this counteroffensive and get deeper behind Russian lines.
And how many Ukrainians are involved in the River Fleet? Who are they and what's their experience? You mentioned that some of the vessels have been brought from the Black Sea and the Sea Azov. Do they all have quite a lot of experience?
They've all got varying degrees of experience. I mean, some of them have been serving aboard vessels for years. You know, some of them were from Crimea originally, and so they had to leave Crimea during the Russian takeover there in 2014. Some were from Mariupol, in fact, and they had to march out of Mariupol by land, on foot, by cars, or get hundreds of miles away from the Russians after their vessels were destroyed in harbors in Mariupol. You know, some of them had gone out to try and fight the Russians in the Azov Sea, and then they'd been told to go back to base because they were so overwhelmed. I think it was 19-1 at the time that they were going out to try and fight the Russians in the Azov Sea, and they were told just to go back and march out of Mariupol to save themselves. So they are quite experienced. I mean, they're often experienced on different vessels, much larger vessels. So we spoke to the captain of a dauntless American fast patrol boat that's been gifted to the Ukrainians. He was a commander on a much larger ship, a kind of a landing ship with about 200 crew before, and now he's commanding a kind of 8-man team with a completely different set of specifics. So it's a very fast, very maneuverable boat, which is unarmored. It relies on its maneuverability to avoid enemy drones and enemy incoming fire, and it has heavy armament itself. It's got 3 heavy caliber machine guns and a very heavy automated grenade launcher, but it's still vulnerable to attack.
You write about the Butcher, the Ukrainian-built gunboat. It's one of 20 commissioned. How many do the Ukrainians have, and what is their capability?
So 20 commissioned, there have been several destroyed. They're obviously very cagey about saying how many they have left, but they are cutting-edge vessels. So the last one was built in Kiev, and it was called the Butcher because actually it was commissioned after the massacre in Bucha by Russian soldiers, and it's a kind of reminder of the worst excesses of Russian brutality during the invasion in Ukraine. So that boat particularly, it's got twin automated cannons that can lock onto targets using radar. It's got anti-tank guided missiles. It's got heavy machine guns as well. It's got grenade launchers. So it's a small gunboat, but it's pretty ferociously armed, and it's been useful both against other boats who are coming down the Dnipro from Belarus, against the Shahed drones that have been terrorizing Kiev and other cities along the Dnipro recently, and also for attacking Russian defenses and positions on the left bank of the Dnipro, as well as potentially tanks and other vehicles that they can target there.
The Defence Secretary here in the UK has announced that Britain will give 23 on and offshore raiding craft and 20 rapidly deployable Viking amphibious vehicles. Do you know where they might make the biggest impact?
So those Vikings are definitely, they look like they're intended to help support the Dnipro River crossings. Whether they can get there in time is another question. I mean, the Ukrainian Marines are clinging on, but the Russians have obviously decided to send in armor now against them, and that fighting is much more tough than it was at the beginning. And the Ukrainians have been let down as well by the kind of stalling in supplying ammunition at a crucial time for them. You know, they're trying to cross the river and they need ammunition to keep their offensive going desperately, and they're not receiving that from the US particularly. Some of the other vessels, the 2 big minesweepers that Britain is giving to Ukraine, are probably going to be based in the UK, and they're not going to be able to kind of realistically enter service in any of these combat zones because they're simply too big a target for the Russian fleet, which still has naval superiority in the Black Sea.
Can you just give us a sense in those crossings of the Dnipro, how much the left bank has been taken and what kinds of threats and challenges the Marines face when they actually land?
So it's difficult to ascertain exactly how much has been taken because the Marines are being quite careful about revealing the scale of their operations. We can say that hundreds of Marines have crossed, and we can see that an area of the Dnipro River Delta, which is it's small islands, it's lakes, it's swampland. It's difficult to say, you know, anyone definitively owns that area. Some of it's no man's land. It's difficult to fortify positions there. We do know that they need to drive the Russians 25 kilometers back, and they're still some way off doing that, in order to have enough space to build pontoon bridges and for them not to be hit by artillery. So that seems to be the objective, and they want to drive the Russians back at least to a place called Oleshki Sands, which is a kind of big desertified area, which is very difficult for the Russians to cross, and they'll be kind of then have one of their flanks protected. And that would also help them cut off two key roads which lead to resupplies in Crimea and in Zaporizhia. So that would really help the offensive in Zaporizhia as well. So the kind of challenges they face are that there's very thick vegetation, it's very heavily mined, it's difficult to navigate. Only locals really know how to do it. And this is why I spoke to the special forces officer who was helping them navigate this. He's from the Kherson region. He's spent a lot of time in this swampland and on this Dnipro River delta. So getting lost even is a big part of the road, and joining up with other parts of your unit. Landing under fire can be difficult. Pushing into areas where you don't know if the Russians are there. The Russians are trying to fortify them more heavily. The Russians have been there for a long time now, so they've set up cameras and they've got drones, and they've also got air support coming in and bombing very heavily the Ukrainian soldiers that are going into the settlements and the villages to try and capture them in that area. And that is something that I've heard time and time again in amongst Ukrainian soldiers, is that the lack of air support on their side, because they don't have F-16s and the other capabilities they want, whereas the Russians now have very advanced glide bombs which they can drop from about 20, 30 kilometers away and leave before they're detected by or targeted by Ukrainian air defenses.
How did you find the morale with the troops that you spoke to?
So the morale was always surprisingly quite good among the troops that I speak to. I mean, there's insofar as they're very determined, they know exactly what they're fighting for. They don't see there as a choice. They have to defend their land. They have to win their land back. And particularly the people who I spoke to who are from Crimea or they're from Kherson region, they're occupied territories, and they're really determined to go home and get back to their homes. So those people are very determined. But you obviously see after some weeks of fighting in very intense, difficult conditions, the morale starts to waver a little bit. People get very tired. They've been fighting for a long time. It's just sheer exhaustion. But if you speak to the same troops again, perhaps a few weeks after they've had some R&R, their morale has rebounded surprisingly. So I spoke around the Avdiivka region to the 47th Brigade, and they'd been involved in some of the heaviest fighting in the counteroffensive in the Zaporizhia region, and they were withdrawn in October, with people saying basically the 47th Brigade is finished. They've taken so many casualties, they can't be combat effective now. But within a few weeks, I was speaking to them, they're again fighting now in Avdiivka, and they were still really determined. The morale seemed good. They understood why they were fighting. And they were saying, actually, we're ready to die for this land, but is the West ready to provide us with the ammunition that we need to defend Europe and European values?
You mentioned that Special Forces commander who you met. He was from the which Special Forces unit? Can you tell me a bit more about him? Vitali Panov, is that right? What was his background and what did he tell you?
Yeah, so he's a veteran of the anti-terror operation which started in 2014 against Russia's hybrid war. And he was then a civilian when Russia invaded in 2022. But using his experience, he tried to gather together a group of people in the Kherson region to resist the Russians, but was taken by surprise by how quickly Ukrainian units left the area and how quickly Russian units came in. So decided to start a kind of partisan movement. And he had some incredible stories of daring and running through Russian checkpoints fully armed with all their weapons. They're hunting Russians behind enemy lines for about 6 months before they could return to Ukrainian-held territory and become a special forces unit. And he was known as the witch in Russian-occupied territory. They put a wanted poster out for his arrest, and so the Russians were actively hunting him while he was hiding with his partisan unit. But interestingly, they didn't take the option that many partisans do of fighting in plain clothes and then hiding. They always fought in Ukrainian uniforms. They were very proud of that. So it really relied on them having to hide in this kind of dense swampland and this undergrowth. And they had some amazing pictures of their tents in summer months, just hidden amongst the most dense shrubbery you can imagine, so the Russians couldn't find them.
You write in your article about how he almost got killed himself on one, well, probably.
Yeah, as I said, he's from Novokakhovka, which is a town that is controlled by the Russians now, and he's desperate to return there and see it liberated. So he's very, very determined in that. And obviously he's had some brushes with death. His boat was blown up by that mine in August, and it's something that it's sometimes troubling to see, but also you understand the determination behind it when people talk about death in such a matter-of-fact manner. I mean, it's something they've been around for so long now. It's the second year. He's also had been fighting in the ATO operation in 2014. So he's very accustomed to death and killing, and some of the manner in which they talk about it in a matter-of-fact way. It's chilling when you come from a country like the UK where we don't do that. But it also demonstrates how difficult it will be for the Russians to prosecute this war and to continue to take territory. You have so many men like him who are willing to take up arms, even against incredible odds, when they're fighting as a partisan force without supplies, well behind Russian lines.
And he was the person that you mentioned earlier who criticised that the time wasting in capitalising on the gains at Krinky that contributed to a high attrition rate since. What did he put that hesitancy down to?
So he wasn't clear as to why. He said he couldn't understand why they hadn't taken advantage of the surprise factor and pushed further inland. I think he is aware that Ukrainian commanders are reluctant to sacrifice soldiers, and he perhaps criticized that there should have been a more aggressive attempt and taken a bigger risk. And I think he thinks that some of the Ukrainian commanders are risk averse in their deployment of troops. And that has, in fact, the determination to avoid casualties had led to more casualties. But at the same time, this is exactly the moment when we see the US unable to kind of pass new packages of aid to Ukraine to provide weapons and ammunition, and commanders don't know whether they'll be able to replenish the stocks that they have. So they've already started rationing ammunition and equipment because they don't know what will come next.
It's really interesting because President Putin's press conference, at that, he was asked a direct question about the crossings of the Dnipro River and the counteroffensive in that part of Ukraine. And he capitalized politically on it by saying things along the lines of Ukrainian lives were being pointlessly wasted on this operation, and that it was all really for optics, for image, to actually bolster President Zelensky's arguments for more investment and more support for Ukraine as he goes abroad to try and bring in the funding. I suppose he would say that, wouldn't he? But in terms of the reality of what you saw, how does this counteroffensive, do you think, fit into the bigger picture? And I know that there is some optimism that expressed to you when you were there, but do you feel that the Ukrainians are optimistic about what they can do here?
So I think the Ukrainians they're always optimistic, but they are quite realistic. And General Zaluzhny was quite clear when he said that he felt that the war had run into a stalemate situation. Obviously Putin wants to portray the situation as hopeless for Ukrainians, and that's part of the kind of consistent Kremlin narrative. Although there is a grain of truth to the fact that obviously the West has put enormous pressure on Ukraine to demonstrate gains in order to justify to their populations why they continue to spend so much money on supporting Ukraine. So that pressure is real and it does exist. But that, I think, pressure is nothing compared to the desire of Ukrainians to see their land freed. And this is not something that is kind of political point scoring. It's a genuine desire from all Ukrainian people to expel the Russians from their land and to go back to having a peaceful way of life. So that determination is there and real, and I think it's something that Putin doesn't want to recognize. He would prefer to portray this as something like, this is Zelensky's ambition, this is the West's ambition, it's not the will of the Ukrainian people. But in fact, it really is the will of the Ukrainian people. You talk to everyone in Kiev, everyone in the surrounding towns, they're all really determined to see the Russians gone.
And when you came away from that particular area and you saw it in the context of the whole war, how did it look to you?
Well, the war is at a really critical moment, I think, in Ukraine at the moment, because you have these offensive operations going on, which rely on huge amounts of ammunition, new equipment, new soldiers. As supplies are exhausted and personnel are exhausted, it's very difficult to make gains in a counteroffensive operation. And this is the time when you would most rely on the support of your allies for aid and ammunition, but it's exactly the moment when the EU has said it will fail to meet its targets for providing ammunition to Ukraine next year, and the US is unable to get past this blockage in Congress. So it's having a real impact on the Ukrainians, and I think they feel quite frustrated and disappointed that at the time when they should feel like they should be able to rely on the support of the Western allies, support that was promised, and they've been given great equipment. But a lot of this equipment is now running out of ammunition, so which renders it almost useless. So I think they are asking for more support urgently in order to help realize some of the objectives that the West helped them set. And this is Western military advisors, Western generals who war gamed some of these offenses with the Ukrainian generals.
And just overall, how did this particular trip to Ukraine and the front line compare to previous ones that you have undertaken?
I think there was the mood is more realistic and an understanding that we're at a critical moment, and the war could go two ways. I mean, Ukrainians are holding the lines, but also the Russians have launched a big offensive in the east, and they're trying to advance in different areas, including retaking areas of the south, which Ukraine had gained at great cost, only a few miles here and there, but still breaching Russian defenses. And the Ukrainians feel that if they don't have the ammunition, then it could end up leading to a Russian breakthrough. So whereas we were once optimistic that Ukraine could take back territory, it's now kind of the Ukrainians are firmly on the defensive, and it's a rearguard action. So I think there's a mood of realism and somberness. It's also bitterly cold in Ukraine right now. People are worried about the effect on civilians of Russia targeting the heating and electricity infrastructure. We saw a huge ballistic missile attack on Kiev this week, more Shahid drones, which are becoming more advanced. And there's a concern that while Russia went into this war really quite unprepared for the resistance it would face, it's now accommodated that. It's learning, it's developing its economy. It's going to spend 3 times more on defense this year than it did last year. It's mobilized its society to fight the war, and is making technological advances which threaten Ukraine. And at the same time, the West is actually pulling back and getting tired of this conflict. So that makes it a really, really critical and dangerous moment in the war.
And I know you've got more articles to write from your trip. Can you just give us an outline of what else we can expect?
So yeah, I'm writing a dispatch from a Ukrainian helicopter base that I was on before I left Ukraine, which is about the pilots who are flying really kind of museum piece Soviet era helicopters where everything is analog and all of the controls are manual, but they have to fly this without air support, 150 feet from the ground to try and support troops around Avdiivka and defend that almost encircled town. And it's really about the difficulties they face, the kind of negotiations that they were having in order to get new US helicopters that could replace them, could fire the Western munitions more easily that they're being supplied with, but how that's all being held up at the moment because of the decisions in Congress.
Maxim Tucker, it's been really good talking to you. I look forward to seeing that article. Thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much. Pleasure to speak to you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.